On December 30th, 2000, a family went to sleep in a quiet neighborhood in Tokyo. By morning, all four of them were dead. There were no alarms, no witnesses, no forced entry, and the person who killed them did not run. They stayed inside the house. They ate food from the refrigerator. They used the bathroom. They sat down. They waited. And then they left, without taking anything, without cleaning up, and without ever being identified. This case should have been solved. The killer left behind DNA, fingerprints, clothing, weapons, everything investigators usually hope for. And yet, more than 20 years later, no one has been arrested. No suspect has ever been named. The Setagaya Family Massacre is one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in Japan, not because of what is missing, but because of what was left behind. A family with no known enemies, a crime scene filled with evidence, a killer who behaved as if they had nothing to fear, and a silence that has never been broken. Tonight, I'm going to walk through what happened inside that house, who the Miyazawa family was, what investigators found, what the evidence tells us, and why, despite everything, this case remains unsolved. This is not a story about speculation. It's a story about limits, the limits of forensic science, the limits of assumptions, and the limits of how much we believe can always be explained. This is the Setagaya Family Massacre, and this is the open file. Chapter 1. The house at the end of the street. There is a house in Setagaya, Tokyo, that should not be famous. It sits quietly at the edge of a residential neighborhood, bordered by a park on one side and a narrow pedestrian path on the other. The streets around it are calm. Children once played nearby. Families walked their dogs. Nothing about the location suggests violence. Nothing suggests that it would become the site of one of the most disturbing unsolved crimes in modern Japanese history. But on the morning of December 31st, 2000, that house stopped being ordinary. Inside were the bodies of 4 people, a mother, a father, 2 young children, and the person who killed them had not rushed to escape. Instead, the killer stayed. Just after 10 a.m., a concerned relative arrived at the home. The family had not answered calls. No one had been heard from since the previous night. At first, nothing seemed obviously wrong. There were no broken windows, no forced entry. The front of the house looked exactly as it always had. But as the relative stepped inside, something immediately felt off. Shoes were scattered near the entrance. The lights were on. The home felt occupied, but silent. As they moved further in, the reality became impossible to ignore. Police were called. What officers discovered inside the Miyazawa family home would shock even seasoned investigators. The father, Mikio Miyazawa, was found on the first floor near the staircase. He'd been attacked violently, suffering multiple stab wounds. Blood was everywhere. Evidence suggested a struggle. Furniture displaced, signs that he had fought back. Upstairs, the scene was even worse. His wife Yasuko and their 2 children, 8-year-old Nina and 6-year-old Rei, were found in their bedrooms. They, too, had been brutally attacked. The children had not died instantly. The medical examiner would later determine that they had been alive when the attacks began. This was not a quick crime. It was not clean, and it was not impersonal. As investigators secured the scene, something deeply unsettling became clear. The killer had not fled. The refrigerator had been opened. Food had been eaten. Drinks had been consumed. The bathroom showed signs that someone had washed their hands or possibly showered. A computer had been accessed. A couch cushion had been moved, as if someone had rested there. The person responsible for the murders had remained inside the house after killing an entire family. Not for minutes, for hours. This detail alone would make the Setagaya case infamous. But it was only the beginning. The killer left behind an extraordinary amount of evidence, far more than most murderers ever do. Clothing, DNA, fingerprints, personal items, traces of movement through the home. And yet, despite all of it, no one has ever been arrested. No suspect has ever been charged. The case remains open more than 2 decades later. Japan is known for its exceptionally high crime clearance rate. Murders, especially family homicides, are rare. When they do occur, they are usually solved quickly. Confessions are common. Investigations are meticulous. The Setagaya murders defied all of that. This crime did not fit familiar patterns. It did not align with known motives, and it did not behave like a typical homicide. The killer appeared calm, methodical, comfortable, almost as if they knew they had time. To understand why this case continues to haunt investigators, journalists, and the public, you have to go back before the murders, before the police, before the blood, before the house became a crime scene. You have to understand who the Miyazawa family was and why there was no obvious reason for any of this to happen. Because the most unsettling question in this case is not how the murders occurred. It's why they occurred at all. Chapter 2. The Miyazawa family. Before the house became evidence, it was simply a home. Before the headlines, before the theories, before the endless speculation, there was an ordinary family living an ordinary life in one of Tokyo's quietest neighborhoods. The Miyazawa family did not live in isolation. They were not secretive. They were not known to have enemies. By every available account, they were stable, engaged, and deeply rooted in their community. And that is what makes this case so difficult to understand. Mikio Miyazawa was 44 years old. He worked for a major foreign-affiliated company, a job that provided stability and routine. He was described as serious but kind, a man who took responsibility seriously and cared deeply about his family. Friends and co-workers later told investigators that Mikio was not involved in any criminal activity, disputes, or risky behavior. He was not under financial strain. There were no known threats, no recent conflicts. He lived a structured life, work during the day, home in the evening, weekends with his family, a life without obvious cracks. His wife, Yasuko Miyazawa, was also 44. She worked as an instructor at a local driving school, a job that required patience, attention, and trust. She was known as responsible and dependable, someone who followed rules and routines. Like her husband, she had no criminal ties and no known personal conflicts. Yasuko was also deeply involved in her children's lives. Those who knew the family described her as attentive and protective. She maintained the household, managed schedules, and ensured the children were cared for. Nothing in her background suggested instability or danger. There was no sign that she feared anyone. Nina, their daughter, was 8 years old. She attended elementary school nearby and was described as bright and well-behaved. Teachers recalled her as polite and engaged. She was old enough to have routines, preferences, and friendships. Old enough to understand when something felt wrong. Ray, their son, was 6. He was younger, energetic, and playful. At that age, the world still feels safe. Adults are trusted. Homes are places of comfort. Neither child had ever been involved in any incident that would draw attention to the family. There were no custody disputes, no bullying cases, no warnings from school staff. They were, by all accounts, just children. The Miyazawas lived in a newly developed residential area near a public park. Their house was not large, but it was modern and well kept. It sat at the edge of the neighborhood, separated slightly from surrounding homes. The location was quiet, almost isolated at night, but not remote. It was the kind of place where people felt safe leaving doors unlocked. And sometimes they did. There had been minor neighborhood tensions in the past, complaints about noise from the nearby park, disagreements over skateboarding and late-night activity. But none of these conflicts pointed to violence. None involved direct threats. Police would later investigate these disputes thoroughly, but no clear link was ever established between the family and anyone who might want to harm them. No restraining orders, no harassment reports, no known grudges, nothing that explained what would come. In the days leading up to December 30th, 2000, there was nothing unusual reported. No sudden changes in behavior, no cancelled plans, no warnings from friends or relatives. The family prepared for the new year the way millions of others did across Japan. Quietly, at home, together. That night, the Miyazawas did not know they were being watched. They did not know someone would enter their home. And they did not know that by the morning, none of them would still be alive. When investigators began searching for a motive, they found nothing concrete. This was not a robbery gone wrong. Valuables were left behind. It was not a targeted hit. The family had no connections to organized crime. It was not a crime of passion in the traditional sense. There was no known personal relationship between the victims and any suspect. The lack of motive became one of the case's defining features, and it forced investigators to confront a terrifying possibility that the Miyazawa family may have been chosen not for who they were, but for where they lived and when they were there. Because once you remove motive, the focus shifts away from the victims and toward the person who walked into that house. Someone who did not belong there. Someone who felt comfortable staying. Someone who knew or believed they would not be stopped. To understand how that could happen, you have to examine the night everything changed. The final hours of December 30th, 2000. The last night the Miyazawa family was alive. Chapter 3. December 30, 2000. December 30th was a Saturday. In Japan, the days leading up to the new year are traditionally quiet. Businesses slow down, families stay home, streets empty earlier than usual. By nightfall, entire neighborhoods can feel suspended in silence, as if time itself is waiting for the year to turn. Setagaya was no different. For the Miyazawa family, the day began like many others. There were no emergency calls, no reports of arguments, no signs of distress. Everything we know suggests that the family spent the day at home, preparing for the new year. It would be the last full day of their lives. That evening, Mikio Miyazawa returned home as expected. Neighbors later told police they did not hear shouting or disturbances. No one reported screams. No one reported anything unusual. If something went wrong inside the house, it happened quietly. Or it happened when no one was listening. At some point after nightfall, someone entered the Miyazawa home. How they got in is still unknown. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. The doors and windows were intact. This strongly suggests one of two possibilities. Either the door was unlocked, or the killer was allowed inside. Investigators would later lean toward the first option. The attack appears to have begun on the first floor. Mikio was the first to be confronted. Evidence suggests he encountered the intruder near the staircase. A struggle followed. Blood patterns indicated that Mikio fought back, moving through the space as he tried to defend himself. He was stabbed multiple times, suffering fatal wounds. This was not an execution. It was chaotic, violent, personal. Mikio did not die instantly. After killing Mikio, the attacker went upstairs. Yasuko and the children were in their bedrooms. What happened next is difficult to describe, not because the facts are unclear, but because of what they reveal. The children were attacked first. Medical evidence showed that both Nina and Ray were alive when they were stabbed. Defensive wounds suggested fear and awareness. This was not an act of mercy. It was deliberate. Yasuko was attacked afterward. She too fought back. There were signs of resistance, movement, and desperation. The violence escalated upstairs, becoming more controlled but no less brutal. By the time it was over, all 4 members of the Miyazawa family were dead. The house was silent, and then something extraordinary happened. The killer stayed. Instead of fleeing, the attacker moved freely through the home. They opened the refrigerator. They ate ice cream. They drank tea and barley beverages. They used the toilet. They washed their hands. They may have even rested. They accessed the family computer. They did not behave like someone in a panic. They behaved like someone unafraid. The killer also left behind a trail. Clothing was discarded. A jacket, a hat, gloves, a scarf, a hip bag. None of these items belonged to the family. In one room, a knife was found broken at the handle, likely snapped during the struggle. Another knife, believed to have been used in the killings, was also recovered. This was not the work of someone trying to erase their presence. It was the work of someone who either did not care or believed they would never be caught. Sometime in the early hours of December 31st, the killer finally left the house. There were no witnesses. No one saw them exit. No one heard footsteps. No one reported anything suspicious. By the time the sun rose, the Miyazawa family was already gone. When police later reconstructed the timeline, they estimated that the murders occurred sometime between late evening on December 30th and the early morning hours of December 31st. That window spanned several hours. Hours in which a killer moved freely through a family's home. Hours in which no one intervened. Hours in which the crime could have been interrupted, but wasn't. This timeline raised unsettling questions. Why did no one hear anything? Why did the killer feel safe enough to stay? Why was there no urgency to escape? To answer those questions, investigators would have to look closely at the scene itself, because what they found inside the house would become one of the most baffling aspects of the entire case. Chapter 4. Inside the crime scene. When investigators entered the Miyazawa home, they immediately understood that this case would be different. Crime scenes usually tell a clear story. Even in violent cases, there is a logic to the mess, an entry point, a struggle, an exit. Most killers try to minimize what they leave behind. They move quickly. They take what they came for, or they flee in panic. This house did not follow that pattern. It felt lived in. The first floor showed clear signs of violence. Blood was concentrated near the staircase where Mikio Miyazawa was attacked. Furniture had been shifted. Objects were knocked over. The scene suggested a desperate attempt to defend himself against someone who was physically aggressive and determined. But the disorder stopped there. Other areas of the home were almost untouched. Nothing had been ransacked. Drawers were not pulled out. Valuables were still in place. Wallets, cash, and personal items were left behind. This was not a burglary that escalated. Whatever brought the killer into the house, it was not theft. Upstairs, the children's bedrooms were small and familiar. Beds were neatly positioned. Toys were present. School items were left where they belonged. In one room, blood was found on the bedding. Evidence that the attack happened where the child had been sleeping. In the parents' bedroom, Yasuko's body was found among signs of a struggle. Blood patterns suggested movement, steps taken, attempts made, resistance offered. This was not a silent attack. It was intimate, prolonged, close range. And yet, no neighbors reported hearing screams. As forensic teams continued processing the house, they began noticing things that made no sense. In the kitchen, the refrigerator had been opened. Inside, ice cream was missing. Tea bottles had been partially consumed. Dishes were left out. None of it was chaotic. It looked like someone had calmly helped themselves. In the bathroom, the toilet had been used. The sink showed signs that someone had washed their hands. Towels were disturbed. There were no signs of panic cleaning. No attempt to scrub away blood, just routine use. The killer had behaved like a guest. Even more unsettling was the discovery of personal items that did not belong to the Miyazawas. Clothing was scattered in different rooms: a jacket, a hat, gloves, a scarf, a hip bag, all left behind deliberately or carelessly. The sizes suggested an adult male. The style suggested nothing distinctive enough to identify an owner. But these items were not generic trash. They were worn, which meant the killer had been inside the house long enough to remove them. 2 knives were recovered. One had snapped at the handle, likely broken during the initial struggle with Mikio. The second knife, believed to be the primary murder weapon, was found nearby. It had not been taken. It had not been wiped clean. Blood and fingerprints were still present. This was the opposite of careful. The family computer had been accessed. Files had been opened. The mouse had been moved. The system showed activity after the estimated time of death. Investigators could not determine exactly what the killer looked at, but the fact remained. Someone had sat down and used it. They were not rushing. They were not afraid of being caught. Crime scene analysts struggled to classify the behavior. The violence was extreme. The aftermath was casual. Those two things rarely coexist. Killers who act with this level of brutality usually flee immediately or attempt to destroy evidence. Killers who linger are often emotionally connected to the victims. But in this case, there was no known relationship, which led to a disturbing conclusion. The killer felt safe inside that house, safe enough to eat, safe enough to rest, safe enough to leave evidence behind, almost as if they believed they would never be identified. The longer investigators stayed inside the home, the clearer it became. This was not a crime defined by what was taken. It was a crime defined by what was left behind. And that evidence, so abundant, so specific, would soon raise expectations that the case would be solved quickly. Because what police collected that night was more than most investigations ever get. DNA, fingerprints, clothing, weapons, everything you would need, except a name. The next phase of the investigation would focus entirely on those traces. Who the killer was, where they came from, and why, despite leaving so much behind, they seemed to vanish completely. Chapter 5. The Killer Who Stayed. Most murders end with escape. Even in crimes driven by rage, fear eventually takes over. The killer runs. Distance becomes protection. Time becomes the enemy. Every second spent at the scene increases the risk of being seen, heard, or identified. That instinct was absent here. The person who killed the Miyazawa family did something profoundly abnormal. They stayed. Investigators estimate that after the murders were complete, the killer remained inside the house for several hours, not hidden, not frozen in shock, but moving calmly from room to room. This was not a brief pause to catch their breath. This was occupation. They ate food from the refrigerator. Ice cream, partially consumed, was left behind. Bottles of tea and barley drink were opened and drank from directly. There was no attempt to clean up afterward, no effort to disguise what had been touched. This behavior mattered, because eating is not something a person does when they believe they are about to be caught. It requires time. It requires a sense of safety. It requires confidence. They used the bathroom. The toilet was flushed. The sink had been used. Towels showed signs of contact. These were not frantic actions. They were routine. The killer behaved as if the house belonged to them now, as if the people who lived there were no longer relevant. They removed clothing, a jacket, a scarf, gloves, a hat, a hip bag. Some of these items were likely removed because they were stained with blood. Others may have been uncomfortable. But instead of taking them away, the killer left them behind. That decision is critical, because it tells us the killer did not believe those items could be traced back to them. Or worse, they didn't care. Psychologists consulted by police struggled to classify this behavior. This was not impulsive violence followed by panic. This was not a targeted revenge killing. This was not organized crime. The killer showed signs of control after extreme chaos. That combination is rare. One theory suggested familiarity. Perhaps the killer had been inside the house before, knew the layout, knew the neighborhood, knew how quiet it would be at night. But investigators could find no evidence that the Miyazawas knew this person. No photos, no phone records, no prior contact. If the killer felt familiar, it was one-sided. Another theory suggested age. The clothing sizes, the way the killer moved through the house, the casual behavior. all pointed towards someone young, possibly late teens or early 20s, someone reckless, someone who did not fully grasp consequences, someone who believed they were invisible. But youth alone does not explain the lack of fear. Staying inside a murder scene for hours requires something more. It requires a belief, conscious or not, that the system will not catch you. That belief could come from arrogance, or experience, or the knowledge that you do not belong where investigators are looking. The killer accessed the family computer. This detail haunted investigators, because sitting down at a computer is one of the most vulnerable things you can do at a crime scene. It creates timestamps, digital footprints, behavioral clues. Yet the killer did it anyway, not to destroy files, not to search police activity, just to use it, which suggests boredom. Boredom after murder is not normal. It implies emotional detachment. It implies that the killings themselves were not the climax of the event. They were simply something that had to be done. By the time the killer finally left the house, dawn was approaching. The neighborhood remained silent. No witnesses, no alarms, no interruption. The killer disappeared into the morning without urgency, and they left behind one of the most extensive forensic trails in modern criminal history. This behavior should have made the case easy to solve. It should have narrowed suspect quickly. It should have produced a match. Instead, it created a paradox. The more the killer left behind, the harder they became to find, because the next phase of the investigation would reveal something deeply unsettling. Despite everything collected, the evidence did not point to anyone in Japan. Chapter 6. The evidence left behind. Inside the Miyazawa home, investigators collected DNA from multiple sources. Blood found throughout the house did not belong solely to the victims. Mixed among it was blood from the killer. It appeared they had been injured during the initial struggle with Mikio Miyazawa. That injury mattered because it meant the killer had left behind their own genetic signature. Skin cells were also recovered, from clothing, from the bathroom, from items the killer touched while moving through the home. This was not partial DNA. It was enough for a full profile. Japanese police ran the DNA through every available domestic database. There were no matches. They checked criminal records. No match. They checked missing persons. No match. They checked military records. No match. The DNA did not belong to anyone already known to law enforcement in Japan. That was the first major shock. Then came the clothing. The jacket, scarf, gloves, hat, and hip bag were carefully analyzed. Fibers were examined. Manufacturing origins were traced. Laundry residue was tested. Even pollen was studied. What investigators learned was unexpected. Several items were not Japanese. The clothing appeared to have been manufactured overseas. Some fibers were consistent with products sold in Europe or North America. The shoes left behind were a rare brand in Japan at the time. This did not mean the killer was foreign, but it meant they likely had access to imported goods. The shoes told their own story. Footprints inside the house indicated a shoe size larger than average for Japanese men. The soles left distinct impressions. Investigators traced the brand, distribution, and retail locations. Very few pairs had been sold in Japan. None led to a buyer. Then there was the DNA analysis itself. Advanced testing suggested the killer had mixed ancestry, not fully East Asian, possibly part European, possibly part East Asian. This finding caused discomfort. Japan in 2000 was still largely ethnically homogeneous. A mixed ancestry profile significantly narrowed the population, but it also complicated the investigation because it suggested the killer might not be fully integrated into Japanese society, and that raised a new possibility. What if the killer did not live in Japan permanently? What if they were visiting, or transient, or had already left the country? Investigators expanded their scope. They contacted international agencies. They compared DNA against foreign databases. They examined immigration records. They looked at military bases, exchange programs, foreign workers, students. Nothing produced a match. The DNA remained anonymous. One of the most haunting pieces of evidence was the killer's blood type and health markers. Analysis suggested the killer may have had a specific medical condition related to digestion. Enzymes found in waste indicated a sensitivity to certain foods. This was not definitive, but it was rare enough to be notable. Even that lead went nowhere. The more investigators learned about the killer, the clearer their outline became. Male, young adult, physically capable, possibly injured during the crime, comfortable moving through the house, unafraid of consequences, and possibly not Japanese. But knowing what someone is not does not tell you who they are. Fingerprints were another dead end. Several prints were recovered that did not belong to the family. They were clear enough for comparison. But once again, no matches were found in domestic databases. No criminal record, no prior arrests, no known identity. The killer existed in evidence, but nowhere else. By this point, expectations began to collapse. The public had assumed the case would be solved quickly. The media had assumed an arrest was imminent. Even investigators believed the evidence was overwhelming. Instead, it led to silence. Years passed. The evidence remained preserved. The DNA remained unmatched, and the killer remained free. This forced investigators to confront a hard truth. The problem was no longer lack of evidence. The problem was limits. Limits of databases, limits of international cooperation, limits of what forensic science could do without a name attached. As time went on, theories began to take shape. Some focused on the neighborhood, others on foreign presence in Japan, others on random violence, but none could bridge the gap between the evidence and a real person. And that gap would only grow wider as mistakes, assumptions, and missed opportunities came into focus. Because the Setagaya case was not just defined by what investigators found, it was also defined by what they couldn't do, and what they may have done wrong. Chapter 7: Theories and Suspects. When evidence stops pointing to a person, investigators turn to patterns. In the Setagaya case, those patterns were unsettling and often contradictory. Every theory explained one aspect of the crime while failing to explain another. Nothing fit cleanly. Nothing closed the loop. Still, police had to try. One of the earliest theories focused on the neighborhood itself. The Miyazawa home was positioned at the edge of the development, next to a public park and a pedestrian path. At night, that path offered privacy. anyone walking through it would be largely unseen. It was an ideal approach route and an easy escape. There had been ongoing disputes between residents and park users, noise complaints, skateboarding at night, groups of young people loitering after dark. None of it was extreme, but it was documented. Investigators considered whether the killer could have been a local youth, someone familiar with the area, someone who knew the house layout from observation, someone who felt comfortable staying inside after the crime. But no local residents matched the forensic profile. No DNA matches. No injuries reported after the murders. No suspicious disappearances. The theory stalled. Another line of investigation focused on a possible random intruder. This theory suggested the killer entered the home on impulse. Perhaps they saw an unlocked door. Perhaps they were already in the area. Perhaps the family was simply unlucky. This could explain the lack of motive, but it failed to explain the killer's behavior afterward. Random intruders flee. They do not stay. They do not eat. They do not relax. The level of comfort displayed did not align with randomness. Police also explored the possibility of a foreign suspect. The DNA profile suggested mixed ancestry. Some clothing appeared to be imported. The shoe size was larger than average for Japanese men. These details pointed investigators toward international communities. They examined foreign workers, exchange students, tourists, military personnel stationed nearby. Nothing connected. No records of injuries. No matching travel timelines. No DNA matches abroad. The killer remained invisible. One theory that troubled investigators deeply was the possibility of prior surveillance. Someone may have watched the family, not because of who they were, but because of where they lived. The house's location made it vulnerable. Its isolation made it quiet. Its layout could be observed from outside. If this were true, the killer may have planned the crime without ever interacting with the victims beforehand. That would explain the lack of motive. But planning alone does not explain staying. Another theory focused on psychology rather than logistics. Some profilers suggested the killer was testing something. Testing control, testing violence, testing themselves. The murders may not have been the goal. The aftermath may have been staying inside the house, moving freely, using the space, existing among the dead. That behavior suggested something beyond rage or fear. It suggested curiosity. Yet even this theory had limits, because there was no known follow-up crime, no similar murders, no copycat behavior, no escalation pattern. If the killer was experimenting, they stopped, or they were never caught repeating it. As years passed, frustration grew. Every anniversary brought new appeals, new reconstructions, new pleas for information. The Metropolitan Police Department kept the case open, continuing to assign investigators and maintain evidence. But time was working against them. Witness memories faded, records aged, technology moved forward, but the killer remained in the past. The public began to ask harder questions. How could someone leave this much evidence and never be found? How could such a violent crime produce no suspect? How could a case this famous remain unsolved? Those questions turned inward, toward the investigation itself, because at some point, the focus shifted, away from who the killer might be, and toward whether the system had failed to catch them. Chapter 8. Mistakes, limits, and missed chances. Every unsolved case eventually reaches a moment where investigators stop asking who and start asking why not. The Setagaya Family Massacre reached that moment early, because by all conventional standards, this case should not have gone cold. From the beginning, police believed the overwhelming amount of evidence would lead to a fast arrest. That belief shaped the early investigation. Too much confidence can be dangerous. When investigators assume a case will solve itself, urgency quietly erodes. Leads that seem unnecessary in the moment are postponed. Decisions are made with the expectation that answers will come later. In Setagaya, later never came. One of the first limitations was timing. The murders occurred at the end of the year, during one of Japan's longest holiday periods. Staffing was reduced. Administrative processes slowed. Some early opportunities for rapid follow-up were missed simply because the system was operating at partial capacity. By the time normal operations resumed, crucial hours, and possibly days, had passed. Another issue was database isolation. In 2000, international DNA sharing was far more limited than it is today. Japan's forensic databases were largely domestic. Even when investigators suspected the killer might be foreign or transient, there was no efficient way to cross-check DNA globally. Requests had to be made manually. Cooperation depended on bilateral agreements. Many foreign databases were inaccessible entirely. If the killer left Japan shortly after the crime, the trail effectively ended. There were also cultural constraints. Japan's criminal justice system relies heavily on confessions. Investigations are often structured around identifying a suspect first, then building a case through admission. The Setagaya case flipped that model. Here, police had evidence, but no suspect to confront, no one to pressure, no one to interrogate. The system was not designed for that scenario. Forensic science could outline the killer, but it could not name them. Some critics have pointed to missed public outreach. While police did release information, they were cautious about sharing too much. Certain details about the clothing, DNA, and behavior were withheld to preserve investigative integrity. That caution may have cost them tips. Someone, somewhere, may have recognized the clothing. Someone may have known a person who returned home injured. Someone may have heard a confession that never reached police. Without broader exposure, those connections were never made. There were also assumptions that shaped the investigation's direction. The belief that the killer was young, the belief that they were foreign, the belief that they acted alone. None of these assumptions were proven facts. Each one narrowed the search. And every time an assumption is wrong, entire categories of suspects disappear unnoticed. As years passed, evidence aged. Physical items remained preserved, but context decayed. Witness recollections blurred. Neighborhoods changed. Residents moved away. People who might have noticed something subtle no longer lived nearby. Even technology became a limitation. DNA testing advanced dramatically, but without a comparison profile, those advances meant little. The killer's DNA remained just as anonymous in 2020 as it had been in 2001. Perhaps the most painful missed chance is one investigators rarely say out loud. The possibility that the killer was never meant to be caught, not because they were brilliant, but because they were invisible. No criminal record, no stable address, no permanent ties, no reason to be remembered. Someone who passed through life without leaving administrative footprints. At some point, the case stopped moving forward. Not officially, but practically. Each year, detectives still visit the house, still re-examine the evidence, still appeal for information. But momentum cannot be recreated, and the longer a case goes unsolved, the harder it becomes to solve. Not because answers don't exist, but because the paths to them have eroded. The Setagaya case is often described as baffling, but that word hides a simpler truth. This case did not fail because of a lack of effort. It failed because modern justice systems are not built to catch people who exist outside their structures. And that realization leads to a final, uncomfortable question. If someone can commit a crime like this, leave everything behind, and vanish, what does that say about how many others never get caught? Chapter 9. A case that never closed. Long after the crime scene tape was removed, the house in Setagaya never returned to being just a house. For years, it stood as a reminder, quiet, empty, and unresolved. Neighbors passed it daily. Police returned regularly. Flowers were left outside. So were unanswered questions. The murders did not fade into memory. They lingered. In Japan, unsolved murders are rare. When a case remains open for decades, it becomes more than an investigation. It becomes a wound, a symbol of something unfinished. Every December 30th, police renewed their appeals. Officers distributed flyers. Press conferences were held. The same details were repeated. Every year, they hold on to the possibility that one detail, one memory, one confession might still exist somewhere. All that remains are 4 lives that ended violently, and a system that could not explain why. The Setagaya Family Massacre is not just an unsolved crime. It is a reminder that certainty is fragile, that safety is conditional, and that sometimes the truth does not arrive on time. The house is gone. The evidence remains. The silence continues. And until it is broken, the Setagaya Family Massacre remains exactly what it has always been: unfinished.